backtrack maybe a little bit. We were, last week, we took that off. Jeremy did a great job for us on Wednesday nights. And so we'll back up just a little bit to at least get the idea of where we're at. And so as we near the end of the section of study, we had 1 Samuel 16 to 2 Samuel 1, because that's really the proving ground, essentially, for David as he makes his way toward the throne. It starts in 1 Samuel 16 where Samuel gets the call to go find the next king of Israel, and there was an anointed king in the house of Jesse, and you remember he goes, and Jesse had 8 sons, and 7 of them looked just like me. They were good-looking, strong, tall, tall, dark, and handsome kind of thing. That's exactly what Samuel saw when he got to Jesse's house, except for none of them fit the bill. And God told him, like, hey, those guys look the part, and you think that they're the right person, but I'm telling you, that's not the case. There's another guy here that's anointed, and Samuel's like, how could it not possibly be any of these guys? Well, then in walks David, and he's like, oh, man, and he knew instantly. And David may not have looked like all the other brothers, but he knew that that was exactly who God wanted. And so from that point forward, we've tracked David's life toward the throne, and none of it has been pretty. There have been a lot of chapters where we've looked at David's just ignorance, his disobedience, his rebellion, his downfalls and struggles, and they've all led to this point in 1 Samuel 30. And you remember that for a time, actually like 16 months in this period of chapters that we've studied, David had been living among the Philistines, that is, the enemies of his people. He had been living with them. He had actually been deceiving them. He was saying things like, oh, I'm going to fight against the Israelites. That's what he would tell the king. And then he would go and he would kill those people. It's like he was living a double life. And eventually it caught up to him, because the place that the Philistine king had given him to live, Ziklag, David had been deceiving everyone for so long. He leaves to go fight a battle. They send him back because they don't trust him. And he comes back, and Ziklag is just burned. All the women and children are taken. All of his trusted men, they're mad at him because of his own disobedience and rebellion had caused all of this in the first place. So that's where we find ourselves tonight, in 1 Samuel chapter 30. And our thoughts tonight revolve around how we get back to God. Because last week we spent a little bit of time talking about it, but maybe not as much as I would have liked. And so tonight it might be the case that you listen and you think, or maybe you heard that and you're like, well, I'm not really away from God. I feel closer to God right now at the start of 2024 than I have in a long time. And that's fine. Maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you're like, man, I feel like I'm a little distant in my faith, and I'm really banking on this new year to like restart my faith, and I have these resolutions and hopefully it'll spur me along. Well, then 1 Samuel 30 is a good chapter for you. And if you're not that person, if you're like, well, I am close, then file this away, 1 Samuel 30, because inevitably you'll reach a time where you're like, man, I'm just not as close to God as I would like to be. And so what can I learn from David in 1 Samuel 30 that'll help get me back to God? There was a word that people used to use. I haven't heard it used in a long time. I don't know that I've used it in a long time, but maybe some of you who are a little bit older than I remember a time when preachers used to use the word backsliding all the time. Do y'all remember that? Backsliders. And it was usually talking about people that just left the Lord altogether. And I was interested to find out that the definition of backslider is not really that extreme, actually. You would think that the people we classify as backsliders are the people that just completely are gone. They don't come to church anymore, and so they've been backsliding. They're just done. They've quit on the Lord. But listen to the definition of a backslider. The dictionary defines backslide, that verb, this way: to relapse into bad habits, to relapse into sinful behavior, or to relapse into undesirable activities. I read in a commentary about this idea of backsliding, and it was a larger section. I just want to read it to you. I thought it was really interesting. It says, spiritual decay is a gradual process. If it came as a splash of cold water on a freezing day, you'd recognize it for what it is. But Satan is sly, and his tactics are subtle. Even as the onslaught of many diseases can be insidious, the wasting away that occurs in the heart of a backslider is nearly imperceptible. It says this and relates it to David. The backslider does not wake up suddenly one morning and go out and commit adultery. Over a period of time, he may have become lax in his thought or entertained fleshly desires. King David watched Bathsheba undress, and soon it was but a little step for him to give expression to the imagination of his heart. And so basically what I get from that is a backslider, by definition, is not the extreme that we usually apply it to somebody, that they're just so far away from God, but that any person tonight that has relapsed into undesirable activities, or maybe is even entertaining those kinds of thoughts where you're trying to live as a Christian, but you're also sliding into sin in some way or another, you by definition are a backslider. So let me ask you some questions as we set up 1 Samuel 30 to maybe gauge where we are and maybe like face the issue head on. Is there ever a time, or was there a time where you were nearer to God than you are now? And probably I could say, yeah, I mean, it almost kind of goes back and forth. Like it fluctuates from time to time, where maybe almost daily or weekly I feel closer to God than I do at this point. But are you closer than you were before? Was there ever a time where you read the Bible more, or that you enjoyed it more than you do now? Was there ever a time you prayed more, or when you felt like you had your prayers answered more frequently than you do now? Was there ever a time where you won more or influenced more souls than you have won this week? Was there ever a time when you were more completely absorbed or completely devoted in doing God's will than you are right now? If there was ever a time, where you were closer to the Lord than you are now, 1 Samuel 30 is a great chapter for you, where somehow or another we might have lost sight of the value of intimacy with God, of being close with God, having that close relationship, and how I can get back to that high place of blessing that I once enjoyed. And that brings us to David in 1 Samuel chapter 30. It's highly significant to me what you read about David. And I also, actually, Will Thomas asked me this question last night. He was like, Ty, when you read the Psalms, and people always say about the Psalms, this Psalm was written when David was on the run from Saul. He's like, how do you know? Because there's nothing that says David wrote this while, and I was like, well, I guess you just put details together. It's interesting to me that I don't remember, or I can't think of a single Psalm that David wrote in this 16 months that he was living with the Philistines. It's like he's living with the enemy. He's deceiving himself. He's deceiving his men. He's deceiving the king of the Philistines. He's like living in a point of time where he's entertaining sin, dealing with sin in his life. And it's like obvious God wasn't a thought in that moment. God wasn't even on his mind. Spiritual things weren't even on his mind because he was entertaining and living in sin. During that period of spiritual compromise or rebellion or whatever you want to call it, he seems to have not made God a high priority, but that's about to change. So 6 things in 1 Samuel 30 that help David get back to God, and maybe you need them in 2024. Number 1, you got to face the truth. You got to face the truth of what's happening in your life or what has happened in your life. Let's read those 6 verses in 1 Samuel 30. This is what we read the other night, but we'll go back over it again. David and his men arrived in Ziklag on the 3rd day, and the Amalekites had raided the Negev and attacked and burned Ziklag. Now remember, the Amalekites are someone that David had been raiding, okay? These are enemies of Israel. And David's going into their village, and he's killing all the people, and he's stealing all their stuff. And then he'll come back to the Philistine king and say, oh, I really killed those Israelites today. So he's lying to the Philistine king, making him think that he's actually on his side when David's really going to kill Philistine people or enemy people. It's like there's a big lie weaved all together. Well, the Amalekites finally got tired of David coming to bully them and take over their stuff, so they sneak over to Ziklag while David's gone, and they burn it up completely. Take all the women and all the children. That's verse 1. They also kidnapped the women and everyone from youngest to old. They killed no one. They just carried them off on their way. When David and his men arrived at the town, they found it burned. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been kidnapped. David and the troops with him wept loudly until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, also had been kidnapped. David was in an extremely difficult position because the troops, they talked about stoning him, for they were all bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Now, everything that happened in verses 1 through 6, the Ziklag being burned up, the women and the children being taken away, David's 2 wives, them being gone, everything that happened, and there's probably things by extension that happened also, but that was the main detail Samuel points out. Everything that happened, 100% of it was David's fault. Every bit of it. And those guys knew that. That's why they wanted to stone him. Those 600 men are standing beside David saying, David, this is all your fault. The reason Ziklag is burned up is because you were lying to the king and you were going to raid these people and now they've paid us back. Oh, by the way, David, the reason why I don't go home to my wife and children tonight, it's your fault. You're the one. You lied. You were deceiving everyone. You were doing things that you knew you shouldn't do. All of it was David's fault. Every bit of it. There's no one else that could take the blame. It's no wonder the men are so angry. Right there in verse number 6. No wonder he was in an extremely difficult position, the scripture says, because now he's been rejected by the Philistines. Remember, they told him, David, go back to Ziklag because we don't want you to fight with us. Why? We don't trust you. So he was rejected by the Philistines. Now he's been plundered by the Amalekites because they ruined the place that he was actually supposed to go home to. His own men have turned their backs on him because they realized that they're in this situation because of what David had done wrong, and it's all his fault. So now what does David have? Let's think about it. Well, 16 months he's been living in enemy territory. 16 months he's been pretending to be loyal to the Philistines. 16 months he's been ignoring his conscience. 16 months he's been doing what was wrong. 16 months, you could summarize all of those up by saying he's been living away from God. And so now I can just imagine David like walking up the road and seeing Ziklag, like the place he was supposed to go home to, just completely and utterly destroyed. All there is some ashes and some smoke. It's like he's walking there and he's standing there, and David can't blame anyone but himself. It's no wonder why the guys were crying, why everybody was crying so loudly. No wonder why they wanted to stone him, because it was all David's fault. Because of his compromise, because of what he had done wrong, this was the result. I think there's an enormous, important principle at work in 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 6, and that's this, that God can't be ignored, and he won't be ignored. Sooner or later, all of us will have to answer for our disobedience. God is always there. God is constantly, faithfully trying to call our attention to him. And there's 2 ways to respond. Either I answer that call willingly and I do face the truth and I do try to change, or one day I'm just going to have to face up to it eventually, whether I want to or not. And David seems to have realized at this point that he's not going to get away with his sin, that his life had fallen apart because he had left God out of the picture. Now comes a decision. David, will you change? Will you continue to run away from God? But of all the steps probably that David will take out of these few, these are the hardest, right? Or this one is the hardest, to face the truth about yourself. Someone said, and I don't know who to give credit to, but they said, it's true that Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But he added this little part. He said, the truth will set you free, but it'll hurt you first. And that's true in our lives, right? The truth will set you free, but it'll hurt you first. Sometimes facing the truth is hard, and it makes you really uncomfortable, and you have to deal with it in a hard way, but it's true. The truth will set you free, but sometimes it has to hurt you. What happened at Ziklag was totally David's fault, hoping that it would bring him to his knees and send him back to God. Face the truth, number 1. Step number 2, if I want to get back to God, if I want to change my life, if I've struggled with a little bit of entertaining maybe some sins or undesirable activities, things that I'm really trying to work on in my life, what can I do to get back to God? I can remember his love. Look at verse 6 again, how David did fix this situation at the end. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David found strength in the Lord his God. I was actually talking to Jeremy about this the other day in Ephesians 6 and verse 10, where Paul is listing out the armor of God that a Christian clothes himself in as he fights against the wiles of the devil. In verse 10, it says, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. But the Greek word there is actually passive, which means be strengthened in the Lord. It's like Paul was trying to help them realize, as you put this armor on, it's actually God empowering you. You're not mustering up any strength on your own. This strengthening is happening because God is giving it to you. Interestingly enough, the Hebrew word in verse number 6 of 1 Samuel 30 is the exact same. When it says David found his strength in the Lord, it's a passive word, that God strengthened him. David was strengthened by the Lord, that he knew that in and of himself, standing in Ziklag in the smoke and with all the people gone that he cared about, hey, what was he going to do? I mean, there was nothing he could do. He had tried to do everything on his own, and at that time, Jonathan, his best friend, he was nowhere to be found. That was a long gone situation. David is literally at rock bottom, and there's nothing he could do. So what else was there to do but to be strengthened by God? You do it by remembering who God is and repeating your promises or God's promises to you, thinking about what he had done in the past, and that's sort of what happens as we move on in the text. But I think it's interesting that the text says he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. What a telling phrase, in the Lord his God, is. It shows where David's mind drifted to ultimately when he realized, I've got to face the truth here. All of this has happened because of me. And we asked the question in the last point, what's David going to do? Is he going to face the truth or is he going to continue to run? And this tells me, 1 Samuel 30 and verse 6, that David said, I'm just going to turn to God. I know that I can't do it, so I'm going to have to face the truth, and I'm going to have to give myself over to God and remember what he's done for me. I can't help but be amazed by what David realized in that moment. It's like he realized that he was down to nothing, and the ultimate solution to his being down to nothing was to turn to God. I heard a guy say it this way: you'll never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And David was at that point with God. He didn't have anything else. There was no Ziklag, no wife, no kids, no family. All of his men, they didn't have any of their families. At that moment, literally, God was all he had. And he didn't realize how much he needed God until God was all he had. Something like that happened to David, and I think we can be reminded of that as well. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Corrie ten Boom. Writes a lot about the World War II experience and the Holocaust and things like that. There was an excerpt in a book I read of hers one time, and this has always been just profoundly impactful to me. And this is what she said. She said, "Deep in our hearts, we believe in a good God. Yet how shallow is our understanding of his goodness. How often I have heard people say, how good is God? We prayed that it wouldn't rain for our church picnic, and look at the sunshine and the lovely weather. Yes, God is good when he sends good weather, but God is also good when he allowed my sister Betsy to starve before my eyes in a German concentration camp." I read that and I was like, you know, how hard must that have been for her to say something like that? Like, that was a person who realized that in that moment, God was all she had. Faith was all she had. And how much of a satisfaction God was in the most critical and rock bottom moment, like being in a German concentration camp, watching your sister starve to death and being satisfied enough to say God is still good even in that moment. In that moment, moments of adversity and struggle and trial, and I don't even know if those words accurately describe the things she was facing and maybe some of the things we deal with, but the true resources of a Christian are revealed in those moments. When we're in trouble, we turn to the Lord. We remember God's love. We remember what he's done. We remember his promises. We meditate on the examples of how he's delivered people in the past, and that's what carries us through. You want to get back to God in 2024, remember his love. Number 3, need to, go. Yeah.